Okay, so this video is to address the background to the question here. What was life in the USA like for African Americans before the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement and why? So looking at a bit of background will give us a bit of context as to why this happened, why America became a segregated nation. Quick note that this PowerPoint in no way is intended to cover every single aspect, and this, like every other period of history, is quite complex. So I would recommend these videos that I've linked here in the PowerPoint that you can find on the portal. They will give you some more insight into some of the topics that we cover in this PowerPoint. They're all crash course videos by John Green. I recommend them. They are fun and they're quick relatively at least. And I think that they do cover those periods well, and they link them back to the bigger picture as well, which is really important. Okay, so during the Civil Rights Movement, America was essentially, you could think of America as two countries in one. You've got one side of America that looks like this, and then another side of America that looks like this. And I suppose the photograph that best encompasses all of that is the one at the bottom with the drink taps. Right, so equality in the sense that, well, I hesitate to use the word equality, but equality in the sense that both colored people and white people were allowed to use the same facilities, but the quality of those facilities was definitely not equal. And I suppose the worst part of it was that it reinforced for colored people and for white people a hierarchy in the races, a separation in the races. They weren't able to see, for a lot of them, they weren't able to see each other as equal because that's what they grew up with for generations. So the society that they lived in, especially in the 1950s, was one that was characterized, like I said, by segregation, and that is kind of the main theme throughout this entire period of time. It was reinforced legally through Jim Crow laws, which were discriminatory and racist laws, which basically had effect in every single kind of public facility. Now, this just didn't happen in every single American state, but in a group of states in particular that we're going to get to in a second. Not only was this reinforced legally, but also through violence, through things like lynching, which was a brutal and horrific way of terrorizing and killing people of color. And there were groups of white supremacists that were very prominent at the time, such as the Ku Klux Klan, who basically you could consider a terrorist group that became quite political as well, and reinforced segregation kind of like like they thought it was like part of the natural order. So they thought it was their job to try and keep that in line. So the four kind of events or periods that we have to think about leading up to the Civil Rights Movement are slavery, the US Civil War, Reconstruction, and a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Each of these four will hopefully give you some understanding of why America became a segregated nation. So it's worth pausing here to consider what you already know about slavery as you learnt about it in Year 9, and it's also really helpful to connect to knowledge that you've had in the past. So please pause the video here and ask yourself this question. So, briefly, what do we know about slavery? Slaves were first transported to the US in 1619. Importantly, they weren't really seen as citizens. Okay, they were considered property, and you know that property can't have citizenship rights. So a table cannot have citizenship rights, a chair cannot. And in the same way, because slaves were considered property, they weren't afforded the same rights as citizens of the United States. Now that was motivation to treat them as inferior, and this was also supported by pseudo-scientific ideas about race, that people were organized into a hierarchy of races, that some were just more superior than others by nature. This predominantly happened in the South, and slavery was prominent in the South because of the economic importance of cotton farming, which was the main driver and main source of wealth in the South. Not only that, owning slaves was also a symbol of status and wealth, which meant that the more slaves that you had, and if you had a plantation, that means you were powerful and you were wealthy. If you weren't able to own slaves, it was a symbol that you weren't that high up in the social order. So owning slaves became the norm in the South. It became part and parcel of how the South ran. Now, we might find that hard to believe, but generations and generations would pass where slavery was just normal, and that separation between whites and coloreds was just considered part of the everyday. So when we refer to the South, we're referring to the 11 states in the green on this map. These are some Southern attitudes towards slavery. Now, John C. Calhoun was actually a politician, so even people who were very powerful and high up in society had these kinds of views. So, we lead into the Civil War in the mid-1800s. Now, the Civil War was fought between the Union, which was the North, and the Confederacy, which refers to the states that we just looked at, called the South. The Confederacy wanted to break away from the other states and form their own government. And partially the war was fought over the issue of the right to own slaves. So many powerful people in the South considered it a constitutional right for them to own slaves, and that the federal government, essentially the government running the country, should not be able to dictate whether they could own slaves or not. Some people will say that the war was fought over slavery in general, but I think slavery was only one part of it, not the main part. So, halfway through the war, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which is basically a symbolic act to announce that anyone who was a slave should be considered free. And this really was a change in attitude in Abraham Lincoln himself. So, this was a really important period of time in history for African Americans because it was then that they saw symbolically that they were free. So after the war was won by the North, the government obviously had to fix some things up. They had to find a way to bring together white Southerners and newly freed blacks, and they had to make sure that the freedom that the blacks now had would be secure, because remember, they weren't considered slaves anymore. Now, life did actually improve for slaves to somewhat, right? So they obtained public school education, they obtained the right to be a politician and to participate in politics, and the right to vote as well. Importantly, the Constitution actually changed. So the Constitution is basically the highest law of the land that governs how other laws are made. So during Reconstruction, 3 important amendments or changes to the Constitution were passed. The 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery for good, so legally now, not just symbolically, slavery was now illegal. The 14th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to citizenship and all the rights that come along with that. And the 15th Amendment, which gave adult African American men the right to vote. Note that women weren't allowed to vote in general at the time. Still some work needed to be done. Unfortunately, Reconstruction failed for complex reasons, mainly politics. It can be summed up as the politicians who were pushing for racial equality lost power and influence in government. The federal government, or whoever was in the White House, considered that accommodating the racist southern state governments to ensure the unity of the country was more important than the issue of racial equality. So basically, the country staying together and not splitting off again was more important than racial equality. And the amendments were not enforced by the federal government because of this reason. That basically meant that by law, African Americans were afforded all these rights, but in practice, Southern governments who opposed racial equality could now impose laws that restricted the rights of African Americans, and they did do that. So things kind of went backwards because of the compromise that the federal government was willing to make on the issue of race. Now, what that compromise looked like is this: Jim Crow laws. This idea of separate but equal. So in 1896, a Supreme Court case ruled that in Plessy versus Ferguson, that separating the races was not against the Constitution as long as conditions were equal, right? Which is why the civil rights movement is about defining equality. What this meant was it gave state governments a legal right to segregate their societies through a series of laws called Jim Crow laws. And this did not change until 1955. So for a good 60 years, the Supreme Court and the federal government basically supported segregation legally. This idea of separate but equal, which ironically was not true at all. So basically, to summarize, we've got slavery in 1619, which introduced blacks as slaves and created the attitude that blacks were not citizens and had no rights. Then we move into the Civil War, which was partly fought over the South's right to have slavery, and the Emancipation Proclamation that freed slaves. We move into Reconstruction, where there were amendments made to the Constitution to ensure that blacks were afforded rights, but Reconstruction ultimately failed due to politics, which leads into Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically legalized segregation because of a Supreme Court decision, which created the legal doctrine of separate but equal. So that is how we end up with this. This is how we end up at the society characterized by segregation. Hope this video was helpful, and again, if you would like to know more, please check out these links in the PowerPoint.